Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dawn Stover, Research Associate with the SFA Gardens on the beautiful campus of Stephen F. Austin State University. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about starting seeds. Gardening is more popular than ever, especially in times of corona. We've seen what it's a little bit like to have a little food insecurity, and so more people than ever are growing their own vegetables. There are a few things that we can relate to the public on how to get started doing that. And the first thing to know is where you're gardening. So you have to know what USDA hardiness zone you're in order to know what and when and where to plant things. So when you get online, just Google USDA hardiness zone, and it'll let you put your zip code in, and then it'll tell you what hardiness zone you're in. And what that indicates is your average annual minimum temperature. In Nacogdoches, we're in zone 8B, and our average annual minimum temperature is between 15 and 20 degrees. That would be much different than, say, in the Panhandle of Texas or way west Texas or even down in Brownsville. So we need to know what zone we're in, and we also really need to know our first and last frost dates. In Nacogdoches, in East Texas, our last frost date is about the middle part of March, and our first frost date is about the middle part of November. So I need to know that. I need to know when I'm going to plant my tomatoes so that they don't freeze, and I need to know when to plant my cool season things like lettuce so they don't get too hot. So that's the first step in arming yourself into becoming a great vegetable gardener. Once you figure out the zone that you're gardening in, you need to know what's appropriate to grow at any particular time of year. We have cool season crops and we have warm season crops, and truth be told, we actually have another season in Texas, and y'all can all imagine what that would be. It's the hot season. There's a point in time where it's just too darn hot for most of our vegetables, including our warm seasons like tomatoes and cucumbers. It just gets too hot for them to set fruit. Anytime the temperatures stay above about 92 degrees, which is the larger part of our summers, it's too hot to grow many vegetables. However, there are some vegetables that are from hotter regions of the world that do grow in our hot seasons. So starting out, it's a beautiful February day. It's 60 degrees outside, but we're expecting lows in the 20s next week. So I can't grow something that I know is going to freeze. I'm going to grow cool season crops, and those include things like all your cole crops, so broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, kale, collards, all those wonderful cole crops. We can fit in some Swiss chard, we can fit in lettuce and spinach. Some of those are a little bit tender when it gets super, super cold, but they do prefer cooler weather. And our herbs, we have cool season herbs too, like cilantro and dill and parsley. They do much better in the cooler parts of the seasons. Some of our root crops are cool season vegetables. So we can think of carrots and radishes and turnips. I didn't mention mustards when I was talking about the cole crops, but mustard greens are a good cool season. So there's quite a few things that we can grow in the cool season. Most people want to grow tomatoes, and those are warm season crops, but we can also grow cucumbers and corn and squash and green beans in that warm season area. When it gets to be super, super hot, the things that will remain producers in our area are things like okra, watermelon, and field peas like black-eyed peas or purple whole peas. So those things will grow in our hot season. We do tend to plant them in the warm season, but they will produce throughout the hot season in late July and August in Texas when nothing else wants to grow, and you can fry an egg on the sidewalk. I think every gardener needs to be armed with information, and there's information, the World Wide Web is everywhere, and there's everything online. If you're gardening in Texas, you want to go to your land grant wherever your cooperative extension agency is based out of. So in Texas, that's Texas A&M, and so we reference the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Agency. Of course, in Louisiana, it's LSU, Mississippi State, and Mississippi. So wherever you are in the United States, find your local cooperative extension, and they'll have good resources for you online. They will give you a chart on when to plant things. They'll give you windows. So, for instance, you might want to plant your tomatoes, and so the chart in your area might say March 15th to April 15th is when you should plant tomatoes. So all the research has been done for you. It's at your fingertips. This book right here is actually produced by one of my former colleagues, Mr. Greg Grant, who is now currently with Texas AgriLife Extension. This is a really great book, and wherever you are in Texas or in the United States, there will be good reference materials like this too. When I key into the back of this, it gives planting dates, it gives sowing depths, it gives spacing for vegetables. So all I need to know is what I want to grow, and I come to my resources, whether it be online or in a book, and it will tell me how and when to grow what I want to do. Greg's book is great in that it breaks it down by particular plants. So if I want to grow lettuce, I'll just turn to lettuce and see what he says about that too. Your local cooperative extension agency will also list varieties that are appropriate for your area. Texas is such a big state. What we grow in East Texas may not be the best thing for them to grow up in the Panhandle or West Texas. And so we want to know what does best in our region. And that's you'll find that with your local cooperative extension agency. When you access your resources, whether they are online or your printed materials, oftentimes it will tell you how to plant your plants, whether you want to use transplants or if you want to directly sow seeds into the ground. Because Texas, it feels like we have a really long growing season, but we have to remember we have the fluctuations between warm and cold and hot and warm and cold again. So technically our growing seasons are actually rather short. So for instance, in the warm season, which starts about mid part of March, so we know our hot season's right around the corner. May 1st comes around and we're ready to put our bathing suits on and go swimming. So when I'm planting my warm season crops like tomatoes, I want to go in the ground as soon as I can with the biggest plant that I can so that I can get my tomatoes before it turns hot. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that vegetables, plants, most of them are annuals, and they have days to maturity. So what that means is from the time you plant them to the time you harvest, there's days to maturity. Some of them have longer days to maturity than others. Good reference sources will indicate kind of an average on the crop that you're interested in growing. And it'll also tell you on the seed packet. So if you look on the back of the seed packets that you're buying, it should say days to maturity. There's a lot of information oftentimes on the back of this packet too. So this one tells me kind of a general planting time for my zone. It's got a map of the United States that's color-coded. I'd still go with your local cooperative extension because they're a little bit more in tune with what you're doing. Tells me days to germination, which is important. I'll talk about that in a minute. How deep to plant them, the spacing. So, if I'm planting zucchini and it says a 3-foot spacing, I'm going to plant them 3 feet apart because they're going to get rather large. The tendency for most novice gardeners is just to want to plant seeds in about every 2 inches or so. It just seems like this little tiny seed. It's hard to sort of fathom that it's going to turn into this really large bush. And so that's really important to pay attention to. If your plants are spaced too closely together, they won't produce as well. If you're doing something like root crops and they're too close together, they won't get as big. So you want big, healthy, wonderful vegetables. And so those are things that are really important to pay attention to. Being the first part of February, it's a little too late for me to start transplants of my cool season crops. So I'm actually going to start planting transplants. And there's lots of transplants available right now at all the garden centers in town. Even the grocery store has vegetable plant transplants these days. But I am going to start thinking about planting my warm season crops because before we know it, it's going to be time to put those in the ground. I always start my peppers very, very early. Peppers need heat and time to get to be a transplantable size. So I really actually start those in the middle part of January. As February comes around the corner, then I'm starting to plant my tomato seeds for transplants. And then some of our other vegetables like the squashes and zucchinis and cucumbers, they have a really short time between sowing and transplanting. So I sow those about 2, maybe 3 weeks before I'm ready to put them outside. I'm going to go back to my reference chart from the Cooperative Extension Service, and I'm going to see when the appropriate time to plant those things are. And oftentimes they'll give you charts on when to start your transplants too. So there's all the information in the world out there available for you. You don't have to write the story from the beginning. It's written for you. So some plants we want to start directly into the garden, and most of the root crops like carrots, radishes, turnips, those all need to really be started outdoors, so that they, if you transplant them and you damage their taproot, you've basically damaged your vegetable. So we want to start those outside. We start corn outside, and I always start my sunflowers outside too. I find if you start sunflowers indoors, they don't reach their potential height. So you want to start those outdoors. But most of the other vegetables we can start inside, the herbs especially too, we can start inside. I'll talk to you a little bit about planting techniques. The first thing that you need to do when you're starting your seeds is start with a good seed starting mix. So I went to my local garden center and it says seed starting mix. And the reason that we want to do that, one, this bagged soil is sterile. So I know that there are no pathogens, no bacteria, nothing in there that can hinder me from the starting point. And it's also a very fine soil. I don't want something really chunky that has lots of bark or big particles of things like perlite in it. This will have a little bit of perlite in it likely, but it won't have a great deal. Some of our seeds, I mean, if you think about a poppy seed, are as small as dust. And so you don't want them settling in between big particles. And so if that happens, then they get covered up, they don't get light, they don't germinate, and you're not successful. So be sure to get a good clean bag of seed starting mix. So that's going to be a fine soil. I've got some here on the table already put out, but I've wet it down already. So you can see that it's nice and loose and fine. And if I had to sift this in a sifter, it would all sift through the sifter because it's got good, nice, fine particles in it. This particular one has a little bit of a fertilizer charge in it. It says enriched with Miracle-Gro plant food. So I know that once my seeds start to germinate, that they're going to get a little bit of a nutrient charge. Now we can sow our seeds in lots of different things. I really like these little peat cups, especially if you're gardening with children. When you buy these in the store, they're little flattened discs, and then you add water and it sort of grows and swells and turns into this little nugget. You got to be careful because if you leave them on the counter, somebody might think they're a brownie and try to eat them. But one of the things I really like about these is that you can transplant your seeds in here, and then you can take this whole thing and put it in the ground. You don't have to remove it from a pot. This is not the only way to grow things, but I think it's rather easy. And these come as a little kit with a plastic lid. And the plastic lid is very, very helpful at keeping moisture in here to help the soil from drying out, and also to help your germinating seeds from drying out too. So this is not the end-all be-all way, but it's just a really, really fun and easy way. Some things I'll grow in a community flat like this, especially if it's a very, very small, fine seed. You can see there's no cells or anything in here. This is a little bit large for a home garden, but this, for me, for gardening in, the SFA Gardens in 100 acres, I can start a lot of seeds in here for my area. I'm going to start, I think, with an easy seed. Now, the best way that I can tell you on how deep to plant a seed is twice the depth of the width. So if you take your seed, this is a bean, and I don't really necessarily start beans indoors, but it's a good way to show you how to sow to the proper depth. Twice the depth of the width. And so I lay this on my side, and I know it's probably not quite a quarter of an inch, so I'm not going to plant it a little bit more than a half an inch, or a little bit less than half an inch. And I'll push that down all the way into the soil so it's covered up. And then I'll probably do the whole row like that. Another really important thing that you might not think is important, but when you try to remember what you did last year, it's going to be important, is to label all your things. Especially if you're using a multi-cell tray like this, where I might start different types of transplants in here. I want to know what's what and where it is. And so the bean that I planted, it's a bush bean, and the variety is called Amethyst. It's important for me to remember that, because if it is a good producer or if it tastes bad, I need to know that so I can either replicate what I've done or I can not do it again. And I always always write the date that I sow things. So I put that in my little planter, and then when I transplant them into the garden, I'm gonna relocate that label when my transplants go into the garden too. We talked a little bit about days to germination, and so if this particular plant doesn't say days to germination, but if it did, and it's like 5 to 7 days, or 5 to 10 days, or 15 days, and I planted this 3 months ago, it's telling me that my seeds are probably bad. So a lot of our warm season vegetables are nice and big size. They're really easy to work with. But when you get to things like tomatoes and peppers, they get to be a little bit trickier. This is a particular tomato called Pear Drop. And the seeds are a lot smaller than those beans and squash that we were planting. So I'm not going to plant this half an inch down. I'm going to plant it twice the depth of the width, which is not very much because the seed is tiny. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll take a pencil and just make a little bit of a divot in my cell or the pot that I'm planting in, and you just barely want to cover that up. If you plant it too deep, it won't germinate. Okay. Now, if you have really, really fine seeds, like this basil right here, it's super, super tiny. And if you're of the age where you need reading glasses like I do, it's sometimes hard to even see individuals to transplant them. And it's really, really easy to plant these too deep. Basil, I've learned from experience and from literature, needs light to germinate. So I'm actually going to just sow this on top of a community flat, and then once they germinate, I'll transplant them into something a little bit bigger before they're going out into the garden. So you can plant things at half an inch if the seeds are really, really big. You can plant them at just the tip of the length of a tip of a pencil. It's about how deep as I plant my tomatoes and peppers. And then some things need to be on the surface because they're so tiny and they need light to germinate. Sometimes I might lightly cover it with something, but it's easier not to most of the time. Okay, so when your transplants have grown and they're ready to go in the garden, they should be able to come out. If you've sown it in a cell tray like this, they should come out rather easily. I can tell I've got some celery on this end, and I can tell it's just not ready to come out. One easy sort of cheater way you can tell is if they start producing roots through the bottom. I think I probably need another week on this particular tray, although some of my lettuces are about ready to come out. If you have sown them in a tray like this, you want to squeeze the bottom so it comes out. Yeah, I think I'd probably leave this another week or so. I want it to root out just a little bit more so it's a little more sturdy when I put it in the garden. And of course, I've looked at my planting date calendar knowing when my appropriate window for these are to transplant. I want to fertilize my garden ahead of time. I Before I do that, I want to get a soil test. We have a soil testing laboratory here at SFA. If you are not near SFA, any of your cooperative extension agents can give you a soil testing bag, and you can send it in to the nearest location. And you oftentimes will tell the soils lab what you're growing. So if you're growing azaleas or if you're growing vegetables, you say what you're growing, and they'll tell you what you need to add to your soil to get it where it needs to be. I always do a little bit of in the hole slow release fertilizer when I put my transplants into the ground. You can incorporate fertilizer ahead of time before you plant everything, and then when things start to, especially like your tomatoes, once they start flowering, it's time to fertilize again. So vegetables are annuals. They have to do their whole life cycle and produce a big, delicious, wonderful vegetable or fruit for you in a very short period of time. So they're heavy, heavy feeders. So you can't just feed them once and walk away. You have to keep them going. So a good balanced fertilizer the first time that you fertilize is good. Always follow the recommended rate on the bags. Every fertilizer formulation is going to be a different rate. So always follow directions. Know that more is not better. More can actually burn your plants, so read those directions and follow them. Any good gardener knows that a plant is not planted until it's been watered. That is probably one of the most important things when you're planting anything, whether it be a lettuce plant or an oak tree. You need to water that plant in. So when you, whether or not you're sowing seeds or transplanting transplants, go ahead and water your garden right away. In the cooler and milder parts of the warm season, we want to water about an inch a week, and that gets the water to about the depth of about 6 inches in the soil. You have really sandy soil, that water's going to percolate really, really fast, and you're going to have to water more often. If you have a clay soil, that water's going to sit, and you may not have to water as often. When you get that soil test, your soils lab should tell you, the things that you can amend your soil to help it hold water, retain water, or help it drain better. Compost is your best friend in the vegetable garden, so any organic matter that you can add will help, and that will help with water retention too. In the hotter parts of summer, sometimes I water 2 to 3 times a week. Oftentimes, I do let my plants tell me when they need some water, and they'll tell you. They do a little bit of what I call a midday meltdown in the heat of summer, and that's just when the leaves kind of droop. But that's the plant's defensive way of holding in water. And by the evening or the next morning, oftentimes they're back and turgid and full and pretty. But you just have to keep your eye on that. You have to have your shadow over your garden to be a successful gardener. A lot of people are gardening on their patios or in their apartments. You can even garden inside if you have really good grow lights. There's grow lights that are made specifically for vegetable production. So don't let your location be an excuse not to grow your own vegetables, because you can do that. If you're gardening in a smaller space, know that some plants get really big. You probably don't want to grow corn that's going to be 8 feet tall. And a lot of our tomatoes and things get really, really big too. And so look for varieties that are bred especially for containers, and that they have a smaller stature. The seed companies, the breeders have realized that for a good while now, that they need to get a little bit smaller with their plant material. And so there's a whole host of things available for patio type gardens. And so just be sure that when you're shopping for your seeds that it says, appropriate for containers or patios. Okay, so I'm so glad that you joined us today here in the greenhouses at the Piney Woods Native Plant Center at SFA. Thank you for listening in. Thank you for being interested in growing a greener world. Appreciate it. Come visit the gardens. We're still open, dawn until dusk, 7 days a week.